Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. We have Dr. Elisabeth Fine with us, and Dr. Fine comes to us from Voyager Therapeutics. And Elisabeth, if you don't mind, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Elisabeth Fine. I head the medical affairs group at Voyager Therapeutics. I have been in the industry for about 15 years now, and prior to that, I was a research scientist. My specialty area is vision science.
That's, first of all, kind of interesting. You transitioned from being a bench scientist to being in medical affairs, and you've sort of grown through that whole process. What was that like? What was the change? I thought the pharma industry is the dark side, if you will. So how was that transition for you?
It was hard. And just to clarify, so I wasn't actually a bench scientist. I was a human scientist. So I was a vision scientist who studied the visual consequences of eye diseases of the elderly. So I was looking at how older adults with macular degeneration and cataract were losing their ability to see certain features in the visual world and to use eye movements to track and gain information over space and time. So I've been working with patients since technically, I guess, since before my grad school days, but certainly since my grad school days. And, you know, when I transitioned to academia, I went from being a vision scientist at an eye research institute to doing publications management at an oncology company. Because if you're going to change careers, just go for it. So it was really challenging. And I remember an early conversation that I had with a colleague of mine at my first job, who helped me to really understand that in many ways, I was an octagonal peg in a round hole. So I didn't quite fit in, and I was struggling to fit in. And part of that was because I was in a completely new area and a new environment. And part of it was because I think for the first time in a very long time, I was in an environment where I was working with a number of colleagues whose expertise was so disparate from mine that I struggled to recognize that it was expertise.
That's an interesting answer. You struggle to recognize their own expertise. Okay.
Yeah. And so I started in the publications domain. And I think that, you know, that part is the only one that actually makes sense in my transition, because when I was working with a career counselor as a postdoc, trying to figure out if I wanted to continue to do the academic route or do something else, the one constant that has always been true for me since even before I decided to pursue science is communicating is more of the thing that gets me out of bed in the morning, and educating about something is more about what gets me out of bed in the morning than doing the thing. Yeah. And so it actually, while I fell into publications quite by accident, it's been a great career since then. I have had no regrets looking back.
Very cool. So now you talk about publications, and as you know, publications are huge in medical affairs. Yeah. So let's start with the absolute basic. Everyone talks about publication planning. What exactly is it, and what are the most common mistakes people make when they start doing publication planning?
Yeah, those are good questions. So publication planning is the thoughtful understanding of how the data that you will be collecting can be represented in the outside world, and how you can tell a story of your programs over time, both with the data that you and your company are developing, but also in review articles and disease state articles, et cetera. So to me, you know, oftentimes when you look at a medical affairs function, or you talk to people, communication strategy and publications planning are thought of as separate things. They talk about a publication strategy. I don't do publication strategies. I have a communication strategy and a publication plan to support that overall communication strategy. And so I think that the mistake that many people make is that they forget that publications planning is really sitting back and thinking about what are the chapters of the story that I want to tell, and what do I need to ensure that my key stakeholders across disciplines are educated on at different times in the drug development process, so that as clinicians are making decisions about whether or not to prescribe a drug, and patients are making decisions about whether or not to participate in a clinical trial or to approach their doctor about a drug, that they are as well educated as they can be in how your drug and your disease that drug is being developed to treat work together.
Go ahead.
So I think that is one of the biggest mistakes, is not thinking about the story. And also then, and I alluded to this a little bit in what I just said, but that you need to tell a different story, or a continuous story with very distinct section breaks, to support different time frames of drug development. So one of the things I see many companies doing is that they don't start publication planning until phase 2 of clinical development. Whereas I would suggest the publication planning, especially in more nuanced diseases or more nuanced therapeutic areas, is best started as soon as you have a development candidate.
So
go ahead.
What do you mean by the word development candidate, though? Are you talking about pre-IND, or are you actually talking about, okay?
I'm talking pre-IND. And the reason I say that is because, oftentimes what happens, especially at bigger companies, is the medical affairs group will work on publications for the clinical data and review articles, et cetera. And then there's also then preclinical data that gets published.
Right.
They're often not coordinated, right? And, when you think about, especially, I work at a company that's developing gene therapies, some for rare diseases, and we are asking patients to take a risk and clinicians to take a risk in a phase 1 trial of taking a therapy that cannot be turned off and that precludes your ability to ever get another gene therapy, quite likely in your lifetime. To me, that says that the least that we can do as a biotech company is to ensure that our preclinical data have been published so that the clinicians and the patients know the work that we have done to get to that point in time.
So several questions jump out to me from that. So what I love about what you're saying is that you need to tell that cohesive story. And publication planning is part of that cohesive story. But here's my question. How do you make sure that physicians hear that cohesive story?
That's a great question. Yeah, you can't. You do your best. It's particularly challenging when you're at a small biotech, or even the larger biotechs that don't engage with a field staff, medical science liaisons, or others early in development, right? Because that is one way to help with that continuity of storytelling. Yeah. I think that, part of it is that, we all, I think, acknowledge that every publication, whether it be a Congress abstract or a peer-reviewed study, every publication has to tell a standalone story. Mm-hmm. But again, in the context of a communication strategy and in the context of a well-developed publication plan to support that, you should be tying links back and forth amongst your publications. Right. And you should be working in other channels to amplify the message of the publications and the story that you're trying to tell over time.
So you talk about other channels. So who should be the team you're working with to make sure the right channels are being pulled in?
I'm going to give you the very unsatisfying answer. It depends.
I'm a lawyer. That's every answer.
Yeah. So it depends. And, I think that, again, if you're in a commercial stage company, then you clearly want to partner appropriately with your commercial organization, because there are things that they can do to amplify message that is easier for them, not necessarily because of different rules of engagement, but more because they tend to have bigger budgets. Let's be realistic.
Right.
I think that, corporate communications is certainly part of the organization that you need to be working with. But I also think that, for each publication, one of the things that we do at Voyager, and I learned first several jobs ago, is, and it's called different things at different companies, but we have what we call publication utilization plans. Mm-hmm. So for each of our publications, we plan how we are going to ensure pull-through of that content across different channels and media. And so I think we do a reasonable job of that from a publications perspective, peer review publications perspective, and a less good job of that from a Congress presentations perspective. It is getting easier these days. It's one of the few bright spots of virtual congresses that it actually, because they're all archived and because they often make the archives available for longer periods for members of the associations, et cetera, that missing an important Congress presentation or missing a poster presentation, you have other opportunities to highlight and help drive people to that content compliantly.
So what you said a few seconds ago was that for commercial organizations, that's what makes the most sense. And you talked about working with your commercial team, if you will. But if, let's say, you're pre-commercial, and in that scenario, I'm visualizing SEC issues, I'm visualizing IP issues, I'm visualizing just tremendous use of press releases.
Yeah.
But I have to imagine that's not as effective as some other methods. So what do you recommend?
Yeah, so I'm going to give away all my secrets here, Darshan. So it's okay. So, again, this is not something that I can say I have implemented. This is a thought. It's a thought experiment for you. Sure. But imagine, if you will, that you had a very well planned out preclinical publications plan. Yeah. And that you had successfully published your preclinical work in advance of filing your IND. Not all of it, clearly, because that's not possible, but at least enough to have support for the mechanism of engagement and the mechanism, the putative mechanism of action, and perhaps some PK/PD data, maybe some tox data. Well, citing that in the investigator brochure is actually a really good way to start spreading the word. Because there's very few documents that we develop that we know get read. Nobody reads labels. We all know that, right? But good investigators actually do read the investigator's brochure, so citing there can be really helpful. But the other thing is finding ways, and again, you need to do this compliantly, because even when you're pre-commercial, I believe that you should follow rules of the road for a commercial organization, because you don't want to have to retrain people later to behave well. But, if you've developed relationships with key influencers in your market, whether they be, more traditional KOLs, or in this instance, much more importantly, digital influencers, you find ways to have them do an RSS feed on your work, because once they pick it up, they will promote it through Twitter. You can certainly work with your authors to self-promote their work. You can work with their institutions to self-promote their work when you're working with external investigators. And the other thing that you can do is there are many journals now that will promote your publications through social media, and then it gets picked up and dispersed and spread. And you can then go and look at what your metrics look like from that perspective and see where it's getting picked up and how it's getting talked about.
No, that's interesting that you go into influencers. I mean, the FDA sort of, at HHS, has been sort of looking at influencers.
Yeah.
And they've not been the most happy with influencers recently because of bad actions by bad actors.
Yeah.
Quite honestly, it started off with some of the nicotine companies, the electronic cigarette companies. Do you, if you're pre-commercial, you probably don't have an FDA regulatory attorney helping you with, well, what are you allowed to say? What aren't you allowed to say? You may not even have a PRC team at that point. You probably have an IP / general counsel type role, or a regulatory / general counsel type role at that point. But then you've got SEC issues to worry about as well. So how do you go, you know what, this is something we need to do, because not because we're trying to really pitch our product, but because we have to tell a story. Yeah. And that's important because it's going to benefit patients in the end. So how do you do that in a way that's compliant?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways you can do it. One is, as you know, many companies do these R&D days, and that's one way to tell the story in a big place. And then, some companies, not all, archive their R&D day recordings and slides on their websites. Yeah. So, I am enough of a geek that I actually went through the 200 slide deck of my company's most recent R&D day before I interviewed, right? But there is nothing non-compliant about an author of a publication posting that publication and the link to it with no commentary anywhere that I'm aware of. Right? Yeah. Especially if it's a science, if it's peer-reviewed literature, my understanding, and again, this is your area of expertise, not mine, but my understanding is that peer-reviewed literature with no additional commentary is considered fair game, right? So
generally speaking, it'd be scientific discussion. Absolutely. By the way, we've got Regina, a team who does say that she's enjoying this very much and she's finding it very informative. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So you can certainly, again, my understanding is that if I have worked with an author to develop a paper, whether they be internal or external to the company, I can also work with them to develop a compliant tweet or LinkedIn post to highlight their work. And by highlight, I simply mean, hey, I just published this paper. Here's a link.
I think you've got to start getting careful. At that point, they start becoming an agent of the company. So it's possible. You just have to be careful about how you word that.
Is that true if it is their paper and it's going out on their LinkedIn and their Twitter, not ours, theirs?
It would be about why are they doing it. Okay. So it's not just are they doing it on their channels, but are they doing it on behalf of you?
That's fair. Yeah. That's an important consideration. I think, though, I have yet to meet the investigator that doesn't want their paper to be read or the author that doesn't want their paper to be read. So what typically happens, and again, this generally happens in conversation, and we should probably start documenting it. So you're raising a really important point, is they ask us, so how can I make sure people see this? Can I share this with my institution's PR?
Yeah.
Well, the answer to that question is always yes. Right?
I'd be careful with that because your IP people may say that I want to make sure everything's sort of covered before you start sharing it.
No, this is only post-publication.
This is post-publication. Then you're fine. You're probably okay. Fair enough.
Right. And to me, all of this is post-publication activity, right? Because you asked, how do you make sure people see it? Yeah. And I think that the other thing that we can do as publication planning professionals is, most influencers, and again, I'm not talking celebrity influencers. I'm talking
Dr. Smith, who happens to really love the topic of, I don't know, Parkinson's. And
exactly. Yeah, there used to be a guy who I followed because I was working with a company that did work in kidney disease, and he called himself Kidney Boy.
Well, shout out to Kidney Boy, I guess.
He was a nephrologist, and he actually did really good work. He did really good work. But, it's, again, these people that are the influencers, they tend to be a younger generation. And so they tend to be the up and coming, what we used to call stakeholders. KOLs. And so, as a publications professional, part of your authorship selection is how much reach do you have, right? When you're thinking about who, and that is certainly a criterion that we should be paying attention to, because if Kidney Boy has 500,000 followers and I want to write a paper on, or I want to work with somebody to author a paper on new therapeutic targets for kidney disease, why wouldn't I work with Kidney Boy?
The question is, how do you pay him, and how much do you pay him, and is that fair market value, and why do you choose him, and does he start charging more because he's Kidney Boy?
So as long as I get to make the decisions, I will never pay an author to develop a paper.
Right.
And I will never pay an author of a paper to promote it.
Right.
However, if they ask for my help in, can you, let's think about this paper and let's target it to a journal that does really good social promotion so that I can then retweet, repost, etc. I don't see any concerns with that.
Sounds like we could do a whole podcast on just this. So let's maybe plan another podcast on just this. Here's another question for you. You're talking about people like Kidney Boy who are putting I don't know how he's become the focus of this, but he has now. Who is putting out information on for himself, but often lands up having an impact on information that's being put out there.
Yeah.
Can that data be mined by, or is that data mined by drug companies to help guide their own publication plans?
It should be.
Okay. And how does that work? And what are some?
Well, yeah, I mean, you do what's called social listening. Right.
Okay.
So if what I want to know is what's getting talked about in the kidney world.
Yeah.
I don't at the moment, but let's say I did. If I want to know, for example, what gets talked about in the kidney world, then I would work with an agency that can comb through the digital world to inform me who is talking about who is talking about what, where, and with whom.
And when would you do this, though? What phase would you start looking at this?
It's an interesting question. I could see doing snapshots fairly early. Like if I was trying to decide whether or not, if I was a company,
yeah,
and I were trying to decide whether I wanted to pursue program X or program Y,
yeah,
and I perceived them both to have unmet medical need because there's no curative therapy out there.
Yeah.
I might do a social listening snapshot.
Let me ask you a question. When is that thought process of am I going to pursue program 1 or program 2 happening? Is that a phase 1 type discussion, or is that a phase 2 type discussion? Because you're usually buying the product and licensing the product, if you will, and that's not happening. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So it actually, stage gating starts very early. So it starts with discovery science.
Right.
So what are we going to pursue? And then okay, now we've pursued and we have two possible, we've, we're having our review of what's in our portfolio, and we've got 7 possible product therapeutic areas that we can pursue. Well, you need to put some business against that determination, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the ways, that's often done through market research. It's often done through literature searches. It's often done through, going to congresses back when we used to be able to do that and talk to networks of clinicians. But another way to do that is to take a social listening snapshot about what's happening within that disease space at that time. So as an example, let's say you were developing a treatment for blue toenails, right?
Yeah.
Let's say blue toenails is a disease, and you're developing a treatment for blue toenails, and what your treatment does is it clears up the blue toenails, but it leads to eczema.
Yep.
Well, one of the things that you can do is you can go to the community sites, both clinician and patient, and listen through a social listening campaign to what they care about with blue toenails, right? It's a patient voice in your drug development. And if, you've got patients out there saying, I hate my blue toenails, but there is no way I would do anything about it if it meant that X is going to happen to me.
Right.
You might decide, that's a very simplistic and probably not a very good analogy, but, you may not pursue that drug because you already know it's not going to be of interest to your target population.
So I guess the question then becomes, you're doing social listening to get information about what's out there, what are patients saying. If you want to see what your competitors are doing, you might do something like shadow publication plans.
Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit about what those are?
Sure. So there's a couple of different ways to think about shadow publication plans. One is to do forensic planning, if you will. And really what that is you look at all of the publications and all of the Congress presentations that a company has done since some milestone, and you
Yeah.
track that against drug development milestones. And what that will help you understand is what's the story the company's trying to tell? Is there a particular position that they are trying to push? Right. As an example, back to my blue toenails, it may be that a company has this great drug to treat blue toenails that results in eczema. So what they might be doing is to be pushing a storyline that, blue toenails will ruin your life, but eczema is no big deal. Right?
Right.
So you can learn from reading them and doing it in a very systematic way. As what we do now is we find papers that are of interest to us when they're published or because we've done a search or whatever, and we read them in some order, but it's not typically in the order that the company has put it out. And so that can be really helpful to understand what their strategy was in terms of their scientific communication getting to a specific milestone. And then the other place where you can do competitive publication and communication planning, and this is actually one of my favorite things to do, is once a drug is approved in the European Union, a European public assessment report is released to the public. So this becomes a matter of public record, and what it has in it is all of the data and the evaluator's assessment of those data, and what the company needs to do in addition post marketing authorization. It's in a package. And so you can look at that and predict the company's publication strategy, and sometimes even their clinical trial strategy for post authorization commitments, which can then help you better understand where you might need to counter position your drug, or where you might need to ensure that their need to do a follow-up clinical trial won't interfere with your ability to do a clinical trial.
So I'm going to ask a dangerous question.
Sure.
this sounds awfully similar to what a commercial team may say in terms of how they want to start positioning their product. Obviously, there's supposed to be a firewall between commercial and medical affairs.
Yeah.
How do you address that issue of, you know what, we're looking at positioning our drug better. We're looking at how our place in therapy is not compromised because of what a competitor is doing. These are questions that commercials definitely looking to answer. So how do you, in medical affairs, sort of go, look, we're trying to answer a question from a scientific perspective, but the implications are exactly what we're discussing. So how do you connect, if you will?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, and I will acknowledge that I tend to use easier words, which tend to be commercials, because they get to use easier words than medical affairs does sometimes. But I think the answer to your question, Darshan, is actually quite easy. If you're going to educate about anything, you need to know what your educational audience knows.
Right.
And if you particularly want to educate, so that's easy when you think about the forensic publications planning, right? Because in order to best plan for your educational and communication initiatives, you want to know what your target population, your target audience already either knows or has the potential to know.
Sure.
So that you can best educate there. Because, there are certainly times when if I want to educate around a certain aspect of a disease state, and another company has developed a therapy that treats the same disease but through a different mechanism of action, it's really important for me to acknowledge that in my education, right? And so I don't think that there's any concerns there at all. And then when I'm thinking through from a more prospective point of view, in terms of looking at, the EPAR and thinking about, well, what's this company going to be educating on in the future? It again can help me to best understand, is it important to me that I get share of mind, which again is a commercial term, but I think from an educational perspective has a very similar meaning, that I educate on this particular area sooner, because it will be very important to have that primacy, which is a truth about memory, right? You always remember the first thing you learned first better, right? Do I need that primacy for this particular educational campaign?
Very interesting. So you're talking about what I would consider to be some relatively advanced type of strategic planning. And if you're doing that, I imagine it's a lot harder to do when you're in a smaller biotech versus a larger biotech. So what are the advantages of being in a smaller biotech? Obviously, the nimbleness helps, but how does that sort of compromise your ability to do some of the strategic plans you want to have?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So I think that, we do a lot more what you might call block and tackle at the smaller companies, especially pre-commercial companies. I think that because I not only can, but enjoy thinking quite strategically, but it helps me to do the block and tackle more efficiently and more effectively. So I'm not able to do these kinds of initiatives today within the organization that I'm in, but I hope to grow the organization, not only the medical affairs part of the organization, but the company that I work with overall, to understand the real value of this kind of thinking to the patients, because that's what I care about, right? I educate clinicians. I am in medical affairs because I believe that by educating clinicians, and more we're having an opportunity to more directly educate patients, but I believe that educating clinicians is the best way to serve patients, especially with more advanced therapeutics. That's why I am in medical affairs. And so I am hopeful that I will be able to grow my organization and grow both my medical affairs organization and as well as grow the impact of medical affairs within the overall organization in a way that they see the value of this kind of thinking, even if we can only implement on a smaller scale.
Now, you talk about the value and the importance of educating patients by educating healthcare practitioners, or professionals in general, if you will. The question I have, though, is as we keep going further and further along, I'm seeing this general distrust that's been formed where MSLs, your field personnel, are not being allowed to actually go and educate physicians, if you will, or pharmacists or nurses or whoever it is, for fear that they might influence them too much. So how do you appropriately balance the need for trust with the reality of I can't reach you?
Yeah. This is one of those places where I miss conferences. I generally hate conferences, but I miss conferences right now. It's an important problem that we're having right now, right? Because I think that there's a combination of institutional trust as well as personal trust that needs to be built. Yeah. And so I think that, when I first came to Voyager, I was the first medical affairs person at Voyager. And most of the people there still don't really know what medical affairs is and does. But nor did the clinicians that I was working with. And, so I was working with academics who had very little experience working with biotech on publications development, because developing publications with investigators is one of the best ways to build trust if it's done well. And I think that, it's picking the right battles. And again, here, it's also sometimes finding the influencers, although this is harder, right? So when you're working in rare diseases, it's a little bit easier because the network is much smaller. But once you have one person's trust, they'll introduce you to the other people.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
But you have to be a trusted source, right? You have to, medical affairs, this I believe, right? So this is my belief, is that the role of medical affairs is to be the educational arm of the biotech industry.
Okay.
I believe that to be true. And I believe that I can track every medical affairs activity that any function does within medical affairs back to an educational initiative. So because that's my mindset, that my role here is to support your education, I don't actually have problems talking and getting access. But that, I think, is because that's how I'm perceived, and I'm in a very small community. But I think that maybe if we thought of ourselves as those educators, we might have those doors opened a little better to us. I don't know.
Okay. Those are pretty profound words. Any last words before we end today? Oh, by the way, we have one more comment. Transparency and education are key to winning physicians' trust. There we go.
I agree with that 100%. I think that, I think the last thing before we go today is that, anybody who works in biotech or pharma is ultimately working for the profit of the company, because that's just the truth of our worlds. But I don't think we should ever do that at the cost of doing what's best for the patients. And I think that if we, whether or not we are in a medical affairs organization that is accountable for patient education at the company that we work for, if we always keep in mind that our work is serving patients, I think we'll do better work.
Very cool. Dr. Fine, Elisabeth, thank you so much for being with us. I hope we can have you again because that was a really fun talk. So thank you again.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Oh, by the way, if people want to reach out to you, because you are full of strategic plans, how do they find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn.
Okay, perfect. That's Elisabeth Fine on LinkedIn. Talk to you guys soon.